Invite you to sign in there. I see a lot of folks joining. We're into the presentation. So if you wouldn't mind clicking that small, thank you. The problem of suffering, following up last time on the problem of evil. Again, our central question for October, why would an all-good God create and allow for evil in his good world? Evil and suffering each night. This is our in-person meeting for our First Communion cohort tonight. So if you're here for First Communion, great, you're in the right spot. I wanted to let folks know that due to the way that registrations played out, we have actually merged our two non-First Communion cohorts. Those are cohorts A and B. They're just going to be one group now that meets on what will usually be the third Wednesday of this month. Please be aware that next Wednesday, due to parent-teacher conferences, we will not be doing either an online presentation or anything here in person, and that'll be bumped in turn to October 28th. As detailed on the schedules, if you haven't received a checklist schedule from me for October, please let me know. I'd be happy to get you one. Excuse me, catching my breath. Two great questions from last time. I posed an open question at the end of our last meeting, this being last week, about the problem of good and evil. What questions do you still have about the problem of good and evil? I wanted to highlight these two awesome responses that folks gave. Somebody really hooked on to what I said about the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary helping a Christian fleet win a naval victory in the Middle Ages. And that's why we have the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary on October 7th. Somebody really fixed on that and asked, why do we ascribe to God like winning one side winning a battle or the other? Does God take sides? That's a great question. Likewise, somebody asked about how does redemptive suffering fit into the Catholic worldview? I thought that was a great question to ask and one that we're going to explicitly address tonight. So we'll address both of these in a roundabout way, one more roundabout than the other. The purpose of these parent meetings is to help you deepen your yes to God. I presume that because you're here, you have some kind of inkling of connection to faith. My desire and my goal with this is not just to fill your head with knowledge, but to help you make a deeper surrender of your own life to God by what you learn here. This is the second installment in our Suffering and Problem series. So tonight, again, unwarranted suffering. Last time we covered moral evil. If you didn't get to tune into our last presentation, I strongly recommend checking it out on YouTube right now, on our YouTube channel. Check it out, it's pretty good. Next time we meet, October 28th, we actually have some options about what we can do. I'll give you an opportunity later in this session to vote on them. We talk about either some options could be angels and demons as an interesting topic. 7 days of creation. Did God actually create the world in 7 days? Or there's a pro-life speaker in town as well. So if you're really interested in learning more about the pro-life movement and what we can do to participate in that as it relates to our faith, I would invite you to vote on those topics later on in our using Pear Deck. So let's start by recalling what we covered in our last webinar about God and evil. This is a Pear Deck response question. This one isn't a text one, it's a multiple choice. So I invite you to look on your phones or on your computers, check it out. The Catechism divides evil into two categories of evil. I've already referenced them in passing. What are those two types of evil? Select from multiple choice answers. Go ahead and hit the show responses. Great. Yes, so the two types of evil we explicitly discussed last time are physical evil and moral evil. Now for the slightly trickier question, what makes moral evil different from physical evil? Again, thinking back to last time, if you were able to join us. If not, I hope you're able to watch the YouTube video. All right, once we hit that 20 again. Okay, so again, the primary difference, and in fact, the distinguishing factor between physical and moral evil is whether or not something has the ability to freely choose to commit that act of evil. This is a slide that I showed last time to try to summarize this difference. So if you notice here, there is God at the bottom, right? God is the foundation, the good basis of all things. Going from that, stemming from God, are all kinds of different good creatures. Rocks are creatures, trees are creatures, stars and moons and whatnot are all creatures. And then there are also other kinds of creatures, humans and angels, more specifically humans and spiritual beings. These are in two different categories. There's those creatures that have free will and those that don't. Again, rocks don't have a free will, not at least in the same way that humans do, right? So humans and angels are empowered with the opportunity to choose to love their creator in a unique way that, like rocks, dogs, stars, the cosmos overall is not. That allows and this presence or absence of free will to create different kinds of evil. So to quickly summarize what we covered last time, moral evil comes from creatures, or moral evil is created by creatures who were created in the image of God, in that they had free will. God desired to create creatures who could love like him, and that means freely, without any compulsion. By necessity, therefore, a creature that can freely love God can also freely choose not to. And when a creature chooses to not love God, then it creates a lack of a good that should be there, right? Think of it like it's missing a piece. There's literally a God-sized hole in that creature's heart that can gradually grow over time through other choices made to be an even bigger hole. There's a lack of something good that should be there. That lack of goodness is called moral evil. Therefore, because God so desired to have creatures that could love like him and could therefore love him like him, God was willing to take that risk, is effectively what theologians argue, and allow for the possibility of moral evil. Kind of boils down to the idea that with great power, with the dignity to choose and that exceptional gift of being able to choose to love like God, comes a great responsibility. And moreover, God allows us the dignity of experiencing the consequences of our choices. He doesn't erase our free will by making the choices we make irrelevant. God allows us the dignity of resting in those choices, even when they are choices that are ultimately not for our own good. So much for moral evil. Now on to tonight's topic, which I've been working long and hard to try to do some good research. So thank you for challenging me on this with those questions earlier, especially. What about physical evil, like the kind of evil that is committed by tectonic plates as they slide into new positions, or cells evolving so rapidly and wrongly that it creates cancer? What about viruses? What about things like that, where no human or no creature seems to have chosen anything, and it just is badness that happens? And then we'll also close by touching on the question, what about suffering that seems unjust, or pain that doesn't seem to have any merit or warrant or meaning? Why would God allow even innocent people to suffer? Now, again, a lot of this is theology kind of basis. A lot of this is theory based on what we've extrapolated and learned from God's revelation in Scripture. We are going to dive into this and see what we can't glean, what wisdom we can't glean from the church tradition on this matter. Why might a good God allow innocent suffering then? Problem of physical evil. In a similar way to how God gives free will to sinners, namely spiritual beings like angels and humans, God gives a certain freedom to the natural world. Rather than creating the world in a perfect state, the Catechism teaches that God freely willed to create the world in a state of journeying. So the world is on its way to perfection. It hasn't reached it yet. The physical world is therefore still lacking some of the goods that are proper to it. This means that good things can exist in the physical world alongside physical evil, which is the lack of a good that should be there. What the interesting thing about this then in turn is that if God gives dignity to humans and angels by allowing us to bear the responsibility of our choices, God gives a similar gift to the rest of creation. It's called free process in theory, or in certain theories, free process, that God endows nature with certain natural laws, and in 99% of cases, God allows those natural laws to play through. So God creates plate tectonics that build massive, beautiful, breathtaking mountain ranges. But in the process, he also allows for earthquakes that can shift and destroy many different, different civilizations, whole civilizations at times. God allows nature to play out according to its natural laws as a result of the dignity that he lends to creation. So that's not necessarily a satisfactory response yet. So I want to push that a little bit further. God wouldn't just, how do we justify the destruction of like a civilization or a group of people by an earthquake? Well, we can start to get there by noting that certain goods, certain virtues like heroism, courage, other things like that cannot exist without some kind of opposing force. For example, little Timmy runs and falls down into the big hole at the end of the cliff, right, or whatever it is. Well, little Timmy falls down the well and Lassie the dog comes to rescue him, right? Then all of his friends get together to heroically pull him out of the hole, right? Practicing in the process self-sacrificial love. That presence of a hole, that presence of something that is an evil and creates a danger, allows for the opportunity for a greater good to exist that could not have existed otherwise, right? Heroism only exists in the presence of evil. There are other virtues that similarly only exist in the presence of evil. While this does not make those evil things good, it does suggest that God can somehow coax good things out into existence alongside evil that otherwise could not have existed. My favorite example of this in scripture, or one of my favorite examples, is from the book of Genesis, where, like the story of Joseph, when he gets sold into slavery by his brothers and all that stuff, kicked down into the dirt, but then rises up to the occasion and becomes like the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. And in the process, saves his family from drought. The same brothers who had exiled him, sold him into slavery, all that stuff. At the end of Genesis, this Joseph, speaking to his brothers, says, "You meant this to harm me. You sold me into slavery because you were jealous of me, but God intended this for good, that this present good may be achieved, that my family, that all of you might be saved." Somehow God brings goodness out mysteriously in the presence of other evils. So that's all well and good, perhaps. It's a beginning to understanding why God might allow physical evil to exist in the world. Does that make innocent suffering okay? Do justifications of greater goods, more complicated goods, does that justify the existence of what an innocent person suffers? Say, a young person, like there's a young man who is currently up for beatification, who died of leukemia at a very young age. Is that justified under that guise of certain goods, or allowing certain goods to exist? The Old Testament, or at least the writers of the Old Testament, wrestled with that question, and they wrestled with it hard, especially in the wisdom literature, especially the books of Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes, and Sirach, because we're Catholic and we have that book in there too. So these are figures in the Old Testament. These books have wrestled with this problem, and one guise under which they especially wrestle with this problem is under the metaphor of hevel, is the Hebrew word for it. Hevel translates to smoke or vapor. This is the word that we see when you hear that famous line from Ecclesiastes, "Vanity of vanities, everything is vanity." That word, vanity, actually translates to hevel, which means smoke. Smoke, everything is smoke. Doesn't quite sound the same. So, what does that mean though? In context, it's a metaphor to describe how when we're wrestling with suffering, when we're trying to decipher its meaning or understand why it's happening, we're like grasping at smoke, right? It looks solid at a distance sometimes. You can't quite see your way around in it. When you swat at it to try to get it out of the way and clear the smoke, it just kind of flutters off and gets back in the way again. It's a metaphor to describe how meaning, suffering, and justice just never seems quite clear. and that for some reason, this is the state of the world. All of our actions, their consequences, and so much of the suffering that we run into, we cannot seem to grasp at it. And the more we try to grasp at it, the more it seems to just floof out of our hands, right? Grasping at smoke. This is perhaps nowhere better illustrated than in the Old Testament story of Job. I actually remember I had a friend in college who was in like an honors English class, and they read the story of Job not as a biblical text, but as an old school, like, history of justice kind of thing. So in the story of Job, we were confronted with this case of a perfectly righteous, perfectly innocent man named Job, right? He's a good guy. Even God in the start of the book says he is righteous and innocent and blameless. Look, is there anybody in the world like Job? He's such a great guy. And Job knows he's innocent and blameless too. After all, he's been working his whole life to be this way. Paradigm of innocence here. And yet, for a reason that God does not explain at the beginning of the book, God allows Job to lose absolutely everything. His children all die, his friends turn against him, his property gets raided and invaded and plundered, loses all of his wealth and well-being, and he is left in dust and ashes with only a group of friends who come to try to console him. And they usually try to console him by saying, Job, you must have committed some kind of sin. Otherwise, God wouldn't be doing this to you. So it's not exactly good consolation. Job maintains his innocence throughout this entire book of the Bible and goes back and forth with his friends defending this claim, and in the end actually looks to God and says, here is my witness, here is my testimony. If you are prosecuting me, God, for some wrong that I have committed, let me sign my defense here. I am innocent. Answer me. Why am I suffering? And that's about chapter 33 of the book of Job. He calls God out for this seemingly unjustified suffering. Go, clicker, go. And then the weird thing in the book of Job is that God shows up. Like, storm cloud rolls in, voice from the heavens speaking right to Job and says, okay, I have showed up to answer you. I will answer your accusations. The tension in the scene could be higher. But Job does not get the answer to the question that he asked. God instead asks a different question. God doesn't answer why Job is suffering, but God instead poses the question, Job, is your perspective big enough to understand on a cosmic scale what justice and suffering and good and evil even mean? He basically argues that, Job, you're working from this assumption that, like, everything should be, for every good action, there should be a good reward, and for every bad action, there should be a bad punishment. But if you try to play that out across an incredibly complicated universe with so many different causes and effects, and you don't know and you can't see the end of all the consequences of your actions, are you really sure that you want to be in a position to judge and proclaim really what is the right thing, what is just, what is good? Do you really think that from your position amidst all of this hevel and smoke, that your suffering is meaningless and that your suffering is unjustified? Basically, Job, after all of this wrestling, after all of this praying and all of this suffering, comes to confront God. God comes back at him with a hard question and says, are you sure that do you really think you have all the information you need to make such a claim as you're making? And Job realizes that he doesn't. He realizes his position in the story is he's a human. He doesn't know everything, and God is an omnipotent, all-powerful, all-knowing God. In comparison to that, Job says, I repent, I will humble myself before you, God, and I will essentially take back my allegation against you that you are an unfair, unjust God. And yet God, at the end of the story, praises Job. He says, yes, you spoke wrongly about me, but I honor your struggle. I honor that you brought this to me in prayer, and I honor your humility. And that's how God responds to Job, and how Job responds to God, even in the midst of suffering that Job never understands in the book. But we're Christians, And so we get a new part of the story that Job didn't get to have. We get the mystery of Christ and the cross, where God, unlike in Job, where God stayed kind of over everything and was Job's judge and prosecutor, God now comes down and enters into our suffering through Christ. He comes to alongside us in the suffering and to bear the pain with us, not just lording it over us. Seeking instead to be a friend and a companion to us and to experience love with his creatures rather than just to be masters over them. He freely subjects himself to the same suffering of his creatures. That is a heck of a condescension for a God who is all-knowing and all-powerful to come and enter into that smoky, hevel, unclear world and to experience its effects. Come on, clicker. This means that God has taken on our suffering and raised it to something new. He has chosen to make it a part of his plan to be close to us and to love us and to connect us. Mysterious way. I love this quote from the Catechism, so I'm just going to read it. God, he makes our miseries his own. By his passion and death on the cross, Christ has given a new meaning to suffering. It can henceforth commandeer us to him and unite us with his redemptive passion. Unity with God is like the whole goal of the Christian project. And configure, interesting word, if I'm breaking it down correctly, like with, and figure, like figure in face. To take on and to be with the image of God. Configure us, it makes us look and experience and be more like God. To enter into suffering in the same way that God did. Now that isn't the end of the story either, because we believe as Christians, again, with firm Christian hope, that at the end of time, when all things are brought together and God makes everything as it should be, creation reaches its perfection, God will clear away all that smoke. He will clear away the veil that lays over our eyes at the moment. And at the end, when we see God face to face, we will understand. We will no longer be puzzled. We will see that our suffering had merit, our suffering had a purpose, and that it has contributed to the creation of the perfect world that God has always dreamed of creating. That's the dignity that we have, even as suffering humans, is that our suffering can serve to help God, who suffers with us, to create the perfect world he has always dreamed to create. So what's our task now? Here we are in the midst of our unclear, enigmatic world that we can't quite understand. How do we respond? We can take cues from both Christ and Job. Like Job, we can ask God for the gift of his wisdom. We can ask to see things the way God sees them, and sometimes God will grant that. He will give us insight into the situation to help us make wise decisions. We should also humble ourselves, and that is one of the hardest things to do. It goes against our very nature in a lot of cases to humble ourselves before God and admit, I don't really know what's to do here, but I'm going to trust in you, God. That is hard. And then like Christ, we can go even further, because now we have somebody with whom we can sympathize. As the letter to the Hebrews says, we do not have a high priest who does not sympathize with our needs. Christ has suffered with us, and so we can unite our suffering to him. And when we unite our suffering with God's, we can rest assured that it is being used. God takes that suffering and uses it for the good of the world. And likewise, like Christ, we can surrender all of our burdens to God and walk with him, even in the midst of suffering we can't understand. Importantly, and I want to end on this note before we get to next month, surrender and humility lead to holiness, right? That's the purpose of why we're doing these parent presentations, right? To help you better assent and understand the mysteries of our faith so you can better surrender your life to God. That's what yields holiness. Pride and the desire to take this into our own hands and determine what is good and evil for me is what goes before the fall of mankind, as we will talk about in more detail next month when we get on to salvation history a little bit. So the choice lays before us, right? And I don't blame you if you're sitting there like, that's a lot tonight. I don't know where to sit on that choice right now. Come on, clicker. So let's pause there, wrap up, and summarize kind of what we've covered for the night. So if you haven't got your phone pulled out for Pear Deck, I'd invite you to pull that out and consider it, or consider adding some responses. List three things, three ideas that you can recall from this lightning round approach to the problem of suffering. I don't expect to have convinced you. I just hope that this has given you some really interesting food for thought. We'll show some of these responses here in a moment, just to get the sharing juices stirred. I appreciate the diversity of responses in here, especially because there's, you know, there. Oh, my mic isn't on. What? My mic's on. Weird. So, yeah, I like the diversity of responses. I saw one response early on that God makes people suffer. It's an interesting claim. Can we say that God makes people suffer? I don't know. That's a great question. Fortunately, there is room at the end of this presentation to ask any questions you still have. So please, if you have questions or if you would like clarity on something, include your questions here at the end of the presentation. A couple concluding thoughts as we bring this presentation to a close. Only Christian faith, as the Catechism teaches, provides a comprehensive answer to the problem of evil. There is no aspect of our faith, whether that's in reconciliation, the sacraments, or another part of our faith. There's no part of our faith that is not in some way connected to answering the problem. So teaches the Catechism. You might notice that I didn't explicitly answer the question of does God take sides in a battle, even though we did kind of touch on the question of redemptive suffering. We're going to cover that idea, can God take sides in a battle? We'll cover some concepts that can be really well applied to that in November, but suffice it for now to say that, like with the story of Joseph, God can and often does work to bring about a good, even where we intend it for evil. Where humans intend to kill each other and harm each other, God is still mysteriously at work to bring some kind of good out of that situation. As horrible and heinous as it seems to be, God never abandons us to exist suffering. Here's the fun voting slide. So with that in mind, we've got some options for topics on October 28th. We can spend a whole hour explicitly addressing your questions on God and evil. We can also spend some time talking about, did God actually create the world in 7 days? Or angels and demons, or pro-life speaker. Any of these topics I would totally be willing to dive into, so please submit your votes on that one. If you've already voted, that's okay. So thank you for your votes. In November, then we'll begin to go from not just the problem of good and evil, but now what's the human story? How has God worked in the midst of, in a world where there is good and evil, to bring about a greater good? So take a few more seconds. If you haven't selected an answer yet, as a vote, I invite you to do so. This is the last slide of our presentation here. For the group in person, we will go into a more kind of prayer time after this to kind of take some time to process what we've heard. If you still have a question about God and the nature of evil, I invite you to submit it here. I don't expect you to agree with me after one presentation, so this is a great place to, put it in any doubts, thoughts, questions, concerns about what I've said. So go ahead and plug it in there. Folks at home, you're good to sign off once you're done. Thank you for joining us this evening.